The radio transmission sounded authentic. Clear signal, strong reception, proper Soviet military protocol, and Major Ivan Volkov sat in his command vehicle staring at the receiver with relief flooding through him because his 44th Rifle Division was trapped on the Raate Road in eastern Finland. Surrounded by Finnish forces, cut off from supplies, running low on ammunition with temperatures at -35°C, and men freezing in vehicles that were failing in the brutal cold. And the situation was desperate enough that Volkov needed orders desperately. Needed guidance from someone higher in command who could see the bigger tactical picture. Needed someone to tell him whether to hold position, or attempt breakout, or surrender, or fight to the last man. "Major Volkov, this is Divisional Command," the voice said in perfect Russian with exactly the right tone of bureaucratic authority. "Hold current position and conserve ammunition. Reinforcements are en route from the east and will arrive within 6 hours. Maintain defensive posture and do not attempt breakout. Relief forces will reach your position by noon. Acknowledge receipt of orders." Volkov acknowledged immediately and felt hope replace the despair that had been building for the past 18 hours. Reinforcements in 6 hours meant they just needed to hold, just needed to survive until help arrived, just needed to endure the cold and conserve their dwindling ammunition. 6 hours was survivable even in -35-degree weather if the men knew relief was coming, even with food running low and frostbite spreading through the ranks. He passed orders to his regiment commanders with renewed confidence: hold position and wait for reinforcements that would arrive by noon. But there were no reinforcements coming from the east or from any other direction. There was no divisional command on that radio frequency giving authentic orders based on actual operational plans. The transmission Volkov heard and trusted and followed wasn't from Soviet headquarters or any Soviet authority. It was from a Finnish radio operator 20 kilometers away who was speaking perfect Russian and using captured Soviet encryption codes. Impersonating Soviet command with such precision that experienced Soviet officers couldn't detect the deception, giving orders designed not to save Soviet forces but to destroy them by keeping them trapped and waiting and frozen in position while Finnish forces prepared for final assault. The voice Volkov trusted with his division's survival belonged to Lieutenant Oskar Lindholm of the Finnish Army Signals Corps. 28 years old, with an engineering degree from Helsinki Technical University, fluent in Russian, that he learned from his grandmother, who had emigrated from St. Petersburg during the 1918 revolution. Expert in radio communications and Soviet military protocols, expert in the psychological warfare that was proving to be Finland's most effective weapon. Deception that turned Soviet discipline against itself through orders that sounded authentic because they were delivered in perfect Russian by someone who understood Soviet command structure better than most Soviet officers understood it themselves. This is the story of the secret that saved Finland from Soviet invasion. The radio trick that defeated armies through psychology rather than firepower. The deception that turned Soviet strength into fatal weakness. The engineer who spoke perfect Russian and used it to destroy Soviet divisions by giving them orders they couldn't refuse to follow. The psychological weapon that killed more effectively than artillery. And the tactic that Soviet command never fully understood, even after losing entire divisions to false orders from an enemy they vastly outnumbered. Let's pause here for a moment. If you find value in stories like this, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. After watching, leaving a brief comment, even a simple word, helps more than you might expect. Your support keeps these stories alive and visible. Thank you. Let's move on. December 1939, and Lieutenant Oskar Lindholm stood before a map of eastern Finland at Finnish Army headquarters in Helsinki, explaining a plan that sounded completely insane to the assembled officers. The Winter War had begun 2 weeks earlier on November 30th, when Soviet forces invaded without warning or declaration, crossed the border with overwhelming military superiority, that should have guaranteed quick victory. 1 million Soviet soldiers against Finland's 300,000 defenders, 3,000 Soviet tanks against Finland's 30 functional tanks, 3,000 Soviet aircraft against Finland's 146 planes that were mostly obsolete trainers. The mathematics said Finland would lose quickly and decisively. Mathematics said resistance was futile against such overwhelming force. Mathematics said the war would be over in 2 weeks maximum, with Soviet victory inevitable. Soviet newspapers had already printed victory headlines anticipating the quick conquest. Soviet generals had already planned victory parades through Helsinki's streets. Soviet diplomats had already drafted annexation documents that would make Finland a Soviet republic by Christmas, and international observers agreed that Finland's independence had maybe 2 weeks remaining before being absorbed into the Soviet Union. But Finland was still fighting after those 2 weeks, and still resisting despite the terrible odds, still inflicting casualties far beyond what Soviet military planners had expected from a tiny nation with obsolete equipment. And they were achieving this not through superior numbers, which they obviously didn't have, not through better equipment, which they couldn't afford to manufacture, but through terrain that favored defenders who knew every forest and lake, through winter conditions that Finnish soldiers understood intimately, while Soviet soldiers from Ukraine and Georgia froze in temperatures they had never experienced, through tactics that exploited Soviet weaknesses that Soviet doctrine refused to acknowledge even existed, and through something else that Lindholm was proposing, something that had never been attempted in warfare at this scale, something that seemed too clever and too risky and too dependent on enemy psychology making specific mistakes. Lindholm was 28 years old, a lieutenant in the Signals Corps with an engineering degree from Helsinki Technical University, where he had graduated top of his class in 1935. Specialized in radio communications, with a thesis on signal propagation in Arctic conditions that earned academic recognition, hired by Finnish State Radio after graduation, where he designed broadcast systems and built transmitters that demonstrated he understood radio technology better than most engineers twice his age. Called up for military service in September 1939, 2 months before the war started, assigned to Signals Corps based on his civilian expertise with responsibility for radio communications in the eastern sector, monitoring enemy transmissions and coordinating Finnish military communications, standard signals work that suggested nothing special would emerge from his assignment. But Lindholm had an advantage that Soviet intelligence planners didn't know about, and wouldn't have considered significant even if they had known. His grandmother Ekaterina Lindholm, born Ekaterina Petrova in St. Petersburg in 1881, who had emigrated to Finland in 1918 during the Russian Civil War to flee the Bolshevik Revolution, settled in Helsinki, and married a Finnish businessman and raised a family, but she never forgot her Russian language or Russian culture even after becoming a Finnish citizen. Spoke Russian at home with her children and grandchildren, taught them the language naturally through daily conversation rather than formal lessons. Oscar grew up genuinely bilingual, spoke Finnish with his parents and Finnish friends, but spoke Russian with his grandmother, who never stopped being culturally Russian despite her Finnish citizenship. He absorbed Russian culture without conscious effort, just through childhood exposure to a grandmother who maintained her Russian identity, learned Russian literature and Russian music and Russian ways of thinking, understood Russian psychology in ways that no language course could teach because he had lived it daily throughout his childhood. This cultural fluency would prove more valuable than any military training or engineering degree when Finland needed weapons that didn't require factories or ammunition to be effective. December 15, 1939, and Lindholm stood before the map explaining his proposal to senior Finnish officers who were desperate for any advantage against overwhelming Soviet superiority. Soviet military culture is based on strict hierarchy and absolute obedience to orders from superior officers. he explained in the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing engineering principles. Soviet soldiers are trained to follow commands without question and without independent judgment. Their entire system depends on centralized control, where lower ranks execute orders from higher authority without debate. The officers nodded because this was well known about Soviet military doctrine, was one reason Soviet forces could coordinate massive operations effectively when command structure functioned properly. But Lindholm continued with the critical insight that would become Finland's secret weapon. This cultural emphasis on obedience creates a vulnerability that can be exploited through radio deception, he said while pointing to captured Soviet communications equipment on the table. If we can transmit orders that sound authentic using proper Russian language and proper military protocols, Soviet officers will follow those orders without questioning their legitimacy. We can impersonate their command structure and give them false orders that will disrupt their operations and create chaos without firing a single shot. Several officers looked skeptical because the proposal sounded like something from a spy novel rather than serious military doctrine. A colonel spoke up with the obvious concern. Soviet forces use encryption codes and authentication procedures specifically to prevent this kind of deception. They're not stupid enough to follow random radio transmissions without verification. Lindholm had anticipated this objection and had his response prepared with the confidence of someone who had already worked through all the technical details. We've captured Soviet encryption equipment and codebooks from battlefield casualties and from abandoned vehicles. We have access to their current authentication procedures. More importantly, I speak fluent native Russian from childhood, and I understand Soviet military culture from studying their procedures in captured documents. I can impersonate Soviet officers convincingly enough that their subordinates won't question the orders because the authentication will be correct, and the Russian will be perfect, and the protocols will follow their expectations exactly. Another officer raised the cultural concern that worried several people in the room. Even if you can technically impersonate their communications, won't Soviet officers eventually realize they're receiving false orders? Won't they verify important commands through secondary channels or through personal recognition of their superior's voice? Soviet military doctrine actively discourages that kind of independent verification, Lindholm explained with the certainty of someone who had studied enemy psychology extensively. Their system is built on the assumption that properly authenticated orders are legitimate and should be followed immediately without questioning authority. Soviet soldiers are trained from the beginning that obedience is absolute, and that questioning orders is the same as questioning the Soviet system itself. Their culture makes them vulnerable to exactly this type of deception, because verifying orders would require independent judgment that their training has systematically suppressed. The room fell silent while officers processed the implications of weaponizing enemy culture against them. The concept was elegant in its simplicity, but radical in its assumption that psychology could be as effective as artillery, that understanding enemy culture could create military advantage comparable to superior firepower. "What do you need to test this approach?" the commanding general finally asked, his tone suggesting he was willing to try anything that might offset Soviet numerical superiority. "Access to captured Soviet radio equipment and encryption codes," Lindholm replied immediately. "Time to study Soviet command procedures and communication patterns, authorization to monitor their frequencies to learn their protocols, and most importantly, Finnish command must be willing to coordinate actual military operations around the false orders I transmit, because the deception only works if Soviet forces following fake orders encounter real tactical consequences that make the orders seem legitimate." The general nodded slowly and authorized a 3-week trial program that would allow Lindholm to develop his psychological warfare capability. 3 weeks to prove that radio deception could work as a practical weapon rather than theoretical concept. 3 weeks to demonstrate that one engineer's trick could offset Soviet tanks and artillery through pure psychological manipulation. The preparation took 3 weeks of intensive work, that combined technical expertise with cultural understanding and psychological insight. Lindholm studied captured Soviet communications equipment until he could operate it instinctively without thinking about procedures, studied encryption protocols until he could encode and decode messages as quickly and naturally as any Soviet radio operator who had been trained at their military academies, studied Soviet military command structure and organizational hierarchy until he understood exactly which ranks gave which types of orders and what phrasing they used for different operational situations. He practiced speaking Russian with the specific accent and vocabulary patterns that Soviet military officers used in official communications, eliminated any trace of Finnish influence from his pronunciation until even native Russian speakers from Moscow or St. Petersburg couldn't detect anything foreign in his speech patterns, practiced the specific tone of bureaucratic authority that Soviet military culture expected from superior officers, the particular rhythm and phrasing that made orders sound legitimate to subordinates who had been conditioned to recognize authentic command voice through years of military service. Lindholm studied psychology as intensely as he studied radio technology, read Soviet military manuals and training documents captured from battlefield casualties to understand exactly how Red Army soldiers were trained to respond to orders, learned that Soviet doctrine explicitly discouraged independent verification of commands from superior officers, that questioning orders was treated as questioning Soviet authority itself and could result in severe punishment. Understood that this cultural emphasis on absolute obedience created a vulnerability that could be exploited if someone could authentically impersonate the command structure that Soviet soldiers were trained to obey without hesitation. He analyzed the specific circumstances under which Soviet officers were most likely to follow orders without verification, circumstances that involved stress and time pressure and isolation from normal command channels. Realized that units cut off from regular communications or operating in difficult terrain or facing tactical crises would be especially vulnerable to radio deception because they desperately wanted guidance from higher authority and would be less likely to question transmissions that offered that guidance using proper protocols. The technical challenge was significant but manageable for an engineer of Lindholm's caliber. Captured Soviet radio equipment used standard designs that were well documented in technical literature. Encryption codes were changed regularly, but captured codebooks provided current information for specific time periods. Authentication procedures followed predictable patterns that could be learned through careful study of intercepted legitimate Soviet transmissions, and Lindholm recorded hours of actual Soviet radio communications to analyze the exact phrasing and tone and rhythm that authentic orders used. But the cultural challenge was more complex and more critical to success because technical authenticity alone wouldn't create effective deception. Soviet officers might detect subtle errors in encryption or authentication procedures, but they were much more likely to detect cultural errors in how orders were phrased or what assumptions they made about Soviet military values. Lindholm needed to think like a Soviet officer and speak like a Soviet officer and make the cultural assumptions that Soviet officers would make. Needed to inhabit the role so completely that his transmissions felt psychologically authentic rather than just technically correct. His grandmother's influence proved invaluable during this preparation period because she understood Soviet psychology from having lived in that culture during her formative years. She couldn't provide military expertise, but she could explain the cultural attitudes toward authority and obedience that made Soviet society function the way it did, could help Lindholm understand the psychological framework that made Soviet soldiers follow orders without question, even when those orders didn't make tactical sense. Russians respect power, she explained in one of their conversations about Soviet culture. Not democratic power or legitimate authority, but raw power expressed through hierarchy and rank. When someone with superior rank gives an order, The correct response is immediate obedience without discussion or debate. Questioning authority suggests you think you're smarter than the system, and the system doesn't tolerate that suggestion. This cultural insight helped Lindholm understand why radio deception could work against Soviet forces even when similar tactics might fail against Western military forces with different cultural attitudes toward authority. British or American officers might verify suspicious orders through secondary channels or question commands that seemed tactically unsound. But Soviet officers were culturally conditioned to assume that superior ranks had information and perspectives that justified orders even when those orders seemed problematic to subordinate viewpoints. January 8, 1940, and the moment arrived for Lindholm's first operational test at Suomussalmi, where Soviet 44th Division was advancing through Finnish territory with numerical superiority that should have been overwhelming. Lindholm sat at his captured Soviet radio transmitter with his hands actually shaking slightly from the enormous responsibility he was carrying, knowing that if his deception failed, it would discredit the entire concept, and his unit would lose the chance to develop this psychological weapon further. He took several deep breaths to steady his voice and his nerves, reminded himself that he had prepared thoroughly, and that his Russian was genuinely fluent, and his understanding of Soviet protocols was as complete as any enemy intelligence officer could achieve. Then he transmitted his first false order using the captured encryption codes and proper authentication procedures that he had practiced hundreds of times during the preparation period. All units halt advance immediately and establish defensive positions at current coordinates, he said in flawless Russian with exactly the right tone of bureaucratic command that Soviet colonels used when giving orders to regiment commanders. Intelligence reports indicate Finnish counterattack preparing from northern sector, consolidate positions, and await further tactical guidance. All units acknowledge receipt of orders through proper channels. Lindholm waited tensely for the response, while his heart pounded and his hands gripped the radio equipment so tightly his knuckles turned white. If Soviet officers questioned the authenticity of the transmission or attempted to verify through alternative communication channels, the deception would fail immediately and probably catastrophically because it would alert Soviet command to the vulnerability. But if they followed the orders without verification, if they obeyed because the transmission seemed authentic and their training demanded obedience to proper authority, Soviet regimental commanders began acknowledging the orders within minutes using proper radio protocols and correct authentication procedures. No one questioned whether the orders were legitimate. No one attempted to verify through alternative channels. No one expressed doubt about halting an advance that had been proceeding successfully according to their tactical assessments. They acknowledged and obeyed immediately because everything about the transmission matched their expectations for authentic orders from division headquarters, because their culture and training gave them no framework for suspecting deception when authentication seemed correct. The Soviet advance halted completely within 20 minutes as regiment commanders passed the false orders to battalion commanders and company commanders and platoon leaders throughout the division. Soviet forces established defensive positions as ordered and waited for further guidance that would never come from their actual headquarters because division command hadn't given those orders and wasn't aware that their subordinate units had stopped advancing. Finnish forces used the unexpected 6-hour delay to reposition and prepare a counterattack from exactly the direction that Lindholm's false order had warned about, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy that made the deception seem even more legitimate to Soviet officers who were hit from the north, just as the fake intelligence report had predicted. The tactical surprise was devastating because Soviet forces had positioned themselves defensively, but in locations that actually favored the attacking Finnish units, had conserved ammunition and energy waiting for orders that created their destruction rather than their salvation. The success exceeded what even Lindholm had hoped for in his most optimistic predictions. The radio deception had worked perfectly, and Soviet officers had followed false orders without any apparent suspicion or verification attempts, had obeyed because their culture demanded obedience when commands came through proper channels with correct authentication. The psychological vulnerability was real and exploitable, and potentially devastating to Soviet operational effectiveness if Finnish forces could expand the deception campaign systematically. Finnish command immediately authorized training additional radio operators who could speak fluent Russian and expand the psychological warfare program beyond what Lindholm could accomplish alone. By February 1940, 12 Finnish operators were conducting deception operations against different Soviet units across the front lines, 12 voices giving false orders that Soviet officers followed faithfully because their training and culture gave them no choice except obedience to what seemed like legitimate superior authority. The impact was measurable and significant in Soviet casualty statistics and operational effectiveness across the entire front. Soviet casualty rates increased noticeably after radio deception operations began, while their operational tempo decreased as units hesitated or repositioned based on false intelligence or waited for reinforcements that never arrived. Their coordination degraded in ways that Soviet command couldn't understand because they had no framework for recognizing that their own communication systems had been compromised through cultural exploitation rather than technical failure. Each false order created small tactical delays that gave Finnish forces positioning advantages, created small moments of confusion that disrupted Soviet operational planning and timing, created small mistakes in unit placement that made Soviet forces more vulnerable to Finnish counterattacks than they should have been given their numerical superiority. These small effects accumulated over weeks of sustained operations into strategic impact that Soviet intelligence analysts couldn't explain through conventional military factors like terrain or weather or tactical competence. The psychological warfare became a force multiplier that made 300,000 Finnish defenders fight as effectively as 600,000 soldiers would have fought, using conventional weapons and tactics alone. Created advantages that physics couldn't provide because radio waves don't care about troop numbers or equipment quality, created tactical opportunities that military doctrine couldn't achieve because traditional tactics assume both sides understand who is giving orders to whom. The deception operations were carefully coordinated with actual Finnish military movements to make the false orders seem legitimate through their tactical consequences. When Lindholm transmitted orders for Soviet units to reposition to specific coordinates, Finnish forces would attack those coordinates to create the impression that Soviet command had accurate intelligence and sound tactical reasoning. When false orders warned about Finnish movements from specific directions, Finnish forces would actually attack from those directions to validate the fake intelligence and reinforce Soviet belief that the orders were authentic. This coordination between deception and reality made the psychological warfare far more effective than simple random false orders would have been, created a systematic program that exploited Soviet cultural assumptions about military hierarchy and obedience in ways that Soviet forces couldn't counter without fundamentally changing their approach to authority and command structure. February 11, 1940, and Lindholm transmitted perhaps his most devastating false order to elements of the Soviet 163rd Division that were attempting to break through Finnish defensive positions near Lake Ladoga. All attacking units immediately cease offensive operations and withdraw to positions held at dawn, he ordered in the authoritative tone that Soviet colonels used for critical tactical commands. Intelligence indicates Finnish reinforcements arriving from southern sector in division strength. Consolidate defensive positions pending arrival of our own reinforcements within 24 hours. Conserve ammunition and prepare for sustained defensive operations. The Soviet units halted their attack at a critical moment when they were actually achieving tactical success and beginning to penetrate Finnish defensive lines. withdrew to their starting positions as ordered and established defensive postures, waiting for Finnish reinforcements that intelligence had warned about, and waiting for Soviet reinforcements that would supposedly arrive within a day. But there were no Finnish reinforcements arriving in division strength because Finland didn't have division strength reserves available in that sector, and there were no Soviet reinforcements coming because Division Command hadn't ordered any withdrawal or defensive repositioning. Finnish forces counterattacked the next morning against Soviet units that had given up advantageous positions and were now defending poorly chosen ground with reduced ammunition supplies. The attack succeeded far beyond what Finnish tactical planning had predicted, because Soviet forces were positioned exactly where the false orders had put them, rather than where sound military judgment would have suggested. The 163rd Division suffered severe casualties over the next 3 days of fighting and failed to achieve any of its original operational objectives, and post-battle Soviet analysis blamed poor leadership and inadequate tactical planning without recognizing that radio deception had created the fundamental problems. The psychological warfare created advantages that physics couldn't provide and tactics alone couldn't achieve, created a weapon that existed only in enemy psychology but killed as effectively as artillery. More effectively in some ways because Soviet forces didn't understand they were being killed by their own obedience, didn't realize their discipline was becoming their death sentence. February 6, 1940, and Major Volkov sat in his command vehicle still waiting for the reinforcements that Lindholm's transmission had promised 6 hours earlier. His men were freezing, and their ammunition was nearly exhausted, but they maintained defensive position because orders were orders, and Soviet military culture didn't allow questioning commands from higher authority, even when those commands resulted in obvious tactical problems. Finnish forces attacked at 2:20 p.m. after giving the surrounded Soviet division enough time to weaken further from cold and hunger and depleted ammunition. The attack was devastating because Soviet forces had positioned themselves exactly where Finnish forces wanted them, had conserved ammunition when they should have broken out, had waited for reinforcements that were never coming because they trusted radio transmissions that sounded authentic. The 44th Division was effectively destroyed over the next 2 days, with thousands of casualties and thousands more captured, and post-battle analysis by Soviet command blamed tactical errors and poor planning, never seriously investigated whether their communications had been compromised through deception rather than technical failure, never understood that cultural vulnerability rather than tactical mistakes had created the disaster. The Winter War ended on March 13, 1940, after Finland had survived 105 days against impossible odds. Finland paid a terrible price with 10% of its territory lost, including the city of Viipuri and the Karelian region, 400,000 people displaced, and 26,000 soldiers killed. But the nation survived with its independence intact when every military analyst in the world had predicted complete Soviet victory within weeks, survived because courage and winter weather and forest terrain were combined with psychological warfare that exploited Soviet cultural vulnerability. Soviet casualties shocked Stalin and shocked the world with their magnitude. 126,000 Soviet soldiers killed and 264,000 wounded against a tiny nation of 3.7 million people, casualty ratios of 5-to-1 in Finland's favor that proved Soviet military competence was far below its propaganda claims. Among the many factors that contributed to this humiliating outcome, radio deception played a significant role that Soviet leadership never fully understood or acknowledged in their post-war analysis. Because acknowledging radio deception meant acknowledging that Soviet culture created exploitable weakness, meant admitting that obedience without judgment was a liability rather than strength, that centralized command created fragility, that the very discipline Soviet military prided itself on could be weaponized against them. Soviet military culture couldn't accept these conclusions without undermining the foundations of their entire system, so they blamed other factors. Blamed weather and terrain and planning failures and execution problems. Blamed everything except the cultural assumptions that made their forces vulnerable to psychological manipulation. The vulnerability persisted through World War II, where German intelligence occasionally exploited the same weakness with radio deception operations. Persisted through the Cold War, where Western intelligence services sometimes used similar tactics against Soviet military communications. Persisted until the Soviet Union collapsed, because cultural change is harder than technical or tactical adaptation. Requires changing fundamental assumptions about authority and obedience and initiative. Requires cultural revolution that Soviet system couldn't survive without ceasing to be Soviet. Lindholm's contribution to Finland's survival remained classified for 40 years because publicizing the radio deception tactic would have eliminated its effectiveness, would have forced Soviet adaptation and made the technique obsolete as soon as enemy forces understood how it worked, so better to stay quiet and preserve the capability for potential future conflicts. Lindholm returned to civilian life after the war and worked as a radio engineer designing systems and building transmitters, said nothing publicly about his wartime innovation or the psychological weapon he had invented. Only in the 1980s, after Soviet glasnost began and the Cold War started ending, did Lindholm speak publicly about what Finnish radio operators had accomplished during the Winter War. Explained how they had impersonated Soviet command with such precision that enemy officers never questioned the authenticity. Explained how they had exploited Soviet cultural emphasis on obedience to turn discipline into a weapon that killed Soviet soldiers without Finnish forces firing shots. The world learned that a small nation had defeated a superpower not just through courage and determination and favorable terrain, but through psychological warfare that understood modern combat isn't purely physical, but fundamentally mental and cultural, through cognitive operations that made enemies defeat themselves by following orders designed to destroy them. Through understanding that the best weapon sometimes isn't the one that attacks enemy directly, but the one that makes enemy attack themselves, that makes them trust your voice and follow your commands straight into tactical disasters. That was Oskar Lindholm's gift to Finland, and the secret that saved the nation from conquest. That was the tactic that turned impossible mathematics into survivable outcome through pure psychological manipulation. That was proof that engineering minds could solve military problems better than traditional military thinking. That was demonstration that the quietest weapon can be the deadliest one when it exploits enemy culture against them. That radio transmission can destroy divisions more effectively than artillery bombardment. That perfect Russian spoken with proper authority can kill more efficiently than perfect aim with conventional weapons. They mocked the idea initially when Lindholm first proposed his radio deception concept in December 1939. Called it fantasy and impossible and unrealistic, said Soviet officers would never follow fake orders from enemy transmitters, said cultural exploitation couldn't work against professional military forces. But they were wrong, and Soviet officers proved them wrong by following false orders enthusiastically and without question. Followed them to their deaths because their culture demanded absolute obedience to properly authenticated commands. And thousands died following orders from Finnish operators who spoke Russian better than many Russians spoke it. Died trusting enemy voices because authentication procedures were correct. Died because their discipline made them vulnerable to deception. Died because obedience without judgment became their execution. Died proving that the most effective weapon sometimes isn't the one that destroys enemy through direct force, but the one that makes enemy destroy themselves through their own cultural assumptions and training. The secret that saved Finland from Soviet conquest. The radio deception that defeated overwhelming military superiority through psychological manipulation rather than firepower. The false orders that Soviet officers followed faithfully because their culture gave them no choice except obedience. The perfect Russian that made enemies trust enemy voices as friendly command. The psychological weapon that proved more effective than tanks and artillery and overwhelming numerical superiority. That was Lieutenant Oskar Lindholm's contribution to the Winter War. That was how one engineer's understanding of enemy culture stopped the Soviet Army's advance. That was how Finland survived against impossible odds. That was how radio became a weapon as deadly as any gun, how language became ammunition as effective as any shell, how culture became a battlefield where understanding enemy psychology mattered more than matching enemy firepower. The cultural exploitation that turned Soviet discipline into Soviet death. The engineering solution to a military problem that traditional military minds couldn't solve. The psychological warfare that killed through manipulation rather than violence. The banned secret that stayed classified for 40 years because its effectiveness depended on enemy ignorance. That was the trick that saved Finland. The radio deception that history forgot, but that changed how nations think about psychological warfare. The proof that sometimes the best weapon is the one your enemy gives you through their own cultural assumptions. The demonstration that understanding enemy culture can defeat enemy armies without the cost and casualties of conventional warfare. Lieutenant Oskar Lindholm speaking perfect Russian into a radio transmitter 20 kilometers from frozen Soviet divisions. Giving orders that sounded authentic because everything about them was authentic, except their source and their intent. Orders designed not to coordinate, but to confuse, not to strengthen, but to weaken, not to save, but to destroy. Orders that Soviet discipline forced them to follow straight into tactical disasters because questioning authority wasn't culturally permitted. That was Finland's secret weapon. That was how the impossible became possible. That was how mathematics that predicted defeat became history that recorded survival. Through one engineer who understood that sometimes the best way to defeat an army is to become their commander and give them orders they can't refuse to follow, even when following means death.